the history of redemption in the Old Testament is initiated by the Lord, directed by the Lord, recorded by the Lord in Scripture, and that it is also fulfilled by the Lord in His coming. And here we're really looking more at the prophetic section of the Old Testament, which continues this history of redemption that the Old Testament gives us. It's fulfilled by the Lord because we have the promise of the renewal of the covenant. God will come to save His people. And that becomes the great message of the Old Testament, that God will come. Now, God must come because the situation is too hopeless for another Savior. Only God can do it. And we're told that the shepherds of Israel have failed in their care of the people, and therefore God Himself must come to be the shepherd of His people. Very familiar passages that we find in Ezekiel in the 34th chapter. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel, prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. The shepherds of Israel have been unfaithful in their duty. And then God says that He will come. Verse 15, I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. The shepherds of Israel have failed in the task. God Himself will come and will be that shepherd. So you see, when Jesus says that I am the good shepherd, He is really identifying Himself with the work of God Himself. And of course, that same passage also goes on to say that He will make David the shepherd. Verse 23, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them, and he will tend them and be their shepherd. So Jesus comes to fulfill the divine shepherding task and also to be the promised son of David, who would be the shepherd king of Israel. So Jesus Christ comes, the shepherds have failed, God must come. And then in Isaiah 59, we're also told that the leaders of Israel, the warriors of Israel, have failed. David was the wonderful warrior king who did succeed in vanquishing all the surrounding enemies. But the other kings of Israel fail in their task, and the people are victimized. The land is invaded, and ultimately Israel's taken into captivity. But there will come one to deliver them. In Isaiah 59, verse 16, God saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So His own arm worked salvation for Him, and His own righteousness sustained Him. He put on righteousness as His breastplate and the helmet of salvation on His head. He put on the garments of vengeance and wrapped Himself in zeal as a cloak, and so on. So the warriors of Israel have failed, and God will have to come. And now He must come because the situation's too hopeless and the other leaders can't do the job. And so God Himself must come. And you see the hopelessness of the situation in Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel 37. You'll remember that the prophet there is given a vision of Israel. There's all Israel, the congregation of Israel before him in the valley. Israel was all assembled as a congregation at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they assembled at the feasts as a congregation. And Ezekiel sees the whole congregation of Israel. But there's a bit of a problem, you'll recall. The first part being that they're all dead. And further difficulty being that all the flesh is gone. They're just bones. And still a further problem, the bones are very dry. And one more point, they're scattered. They're not even assembled as skeletons. They're just bones all over the place. And I'm told that in Lima, Peru, they had so many bones of saints and people who had departed that the bones were all faithfully kept, but they had become disorganized, completely disorganized. And so they set some bureaucrats to work to organize all the bones, and they did. They organized all the femurs together. They put all the tibia together. They fully organized all the bones in bureaucratic fashion. And so if you're interested in ancient tibia, they can show you the proper organization of them. Maybe it's further organized as big tibia and little tibia, I don't know. But these bones don't have good Lima organization. They're just scattered, mixed all over the place. And Ezekiel looks at them. I sometimes suspect some pastors of sharing Ezekiel's feeling when they look at their congregation, but that need a little renewal, you know. But here the congregation of Israel, and not this one, of course. You understand, very different here, and I'm sure in your congregations too, but some are. But here's the state of Israel. See, and the point is, who can fix it? Son of man, can these bones live? And Ezekiel, who's been around the Lord a bit, doesn't give the obvious answer. Ezekiel says, Lord, you know. And then God says, prophesy. And he prophesies. And they all come together, bone to its bone. They all assemble themselves into proper skeletons. And they stand up, and then they're covered with sinews and flesh. And Ezekiel sees the whole thing, you know. And then he says, prophesy. And he prophesies again, and the Spirit of God enters them, and they become a living host. You see the point of that vision. There's Israel in captivity, scattered. It's hopeless. Can this people ever live? And the answer would obviously be no. But not for God. God can bring them back from captivity. God, by His Spirit, can give new life. And, well, I'm caught again. I can never stop on these things, but look at what precedes Ezekiel 37, will you? That Ezekiel 37 gives us the dry bones, but what is it that God says that He's going to do? Verse 24. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Water of cleansing, renewal by a new heart, which obviously is a new life. And Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, right? And Nicodemus says, we believe that you are come from God. And Jesus says, Nicodemus, except you be born again, you cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus is all confused. He doesn't understand about how you can be born again. You certainly can't re-enter your mother's womb. What in the world is Jesus talking about? And Jesus says, I want to tell you about heavenly things, but you don't even understand earthly things. He says, are you a teacher of Israel and you don't know Ezekiel 36? Now, he didn't say Ezekiel 36. He said that you must be born of water and of the Spirit. Isn't that what Ezekiel 36 says? Cleansing with water and the Spirit, right? Giving the Spirit. So Jesus is alluding to Ezekiel 36. And he says, are you a teacher in Israel? And you surely know about Ezekiel 37. Haven't you read 36? Don't you know that God promised a new birth? And that's what the kingdom of God's all about, the new birth that God promised he would bring, and he's brought it, and here it is. We'll get on to thinking about some of these things again in this afternoon. But what I'm trying to show you is you can't get anywhere in the New Testament before you start falling over things that are fulfilled in the New. It's just beginning to be alert to what's going on, how God reveals himself. So the situation's so hopeless, only God can do anything about it. And then the other side of it is that the promises are so great that nobody else could fulfill them. No other Lord could do it. He promises too much. God's always destroying his own credibility. If he wouldn't promise so much, people might believe it. I mean, if he'd promise a little more integrated life, if he would promise a little New Age feely sort of thing, people would believe that. They believe it by the thousands, don't they? But when he promises a new birth, and when he promises a resurrection from the dead, and when he promises a new heavens and a new earth, nobody ever disbelieved the gospel because it didn't promise enough. They disbelieve it because it promises too much. It's too good to be true. That's the problem. If God would just scale it down and not promise so much, then people might believe it, right? Oh, he's a great God. And he promises great things. And Jesus got Nicodemus' attention right away when he started telling him what Nicodemus had to know about. God must come. The situation's too bad, and the promises are too much for anybody else to do them. And God himself is the one who has to do it. Isaiah 65, a new heavens and a new earth. Zechariah, all the promises of what God will do in the latter days. I guess you can recognize the dry bones there, Ezekiel 37, but maybe that one needs some explanation in the golden plate that was worn in the tiara of the high priest. It said, holiness to the Lord. So the high priest had God's name, Yahweh, holiness to the Lord. The name of God, the holy name of God, tied to his forehead in a golden plate. And in the prophecy of Zechariah, it says, in the great day when God fulfills everything, in that day, the holiness to the Lord emblem from the forehead of the high priest will be on the horses' bridles, on the bumper stickers. That everything is going to be holy. The very pots in Jerusalem are going to be like temple vessels. I mean, a lot of pots in Jerusalem for all kinds of purposes, but these pots are going to be as holy as though they were temple vessels. See? And the least inhabitant of Jerusalem will be like King David. And in that day, who will King David be like in the prophecy of Jeremiah? The angel of the Lord among us. See? God himself will come. He will be the successor to King David because he will also be David's own son. But you see the point. In the prophecy of Zechariah and all the prophets, there's always this promise that in the latter days, when the great day comes, then God himself will come. God himself in the midst of his people. He will come. He will be the true shepherd. He will be the divine warrior. the true shepherd, that's Ezekiel 34, the divine warrior, Isaiah 59:16, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, and he will be the rock of Israel. Very briefly on this one, the incident of the rock in Exodus 17. What's that place called? Who knows the name of it? I didn't forget this name. I forget a lot of names, but not this one. What is it, though? Do you know it, too? Massa? Right. What's the other one? Two words. Meribah. Right. Massa means what? No, that's put to Meribah usually, but that was, you get a B+ on that because you've got the right connections. You got the right connections. Massa means trial, and Meribah means law case. Now, the middle of Meribah in English would be the letters R-I-B, Ribba, see? Meribah. And it's a participial form in Hebrew, and Riv, R-I-B, is the word for a law case. And this is a participial form of that word, meaning a law case. Now, that's what it means. That's how it's used all through the Old Testament. It always describes legal proceedings. And that's what was going on in Meribah, because the people in the desert were without water, and they thought they were going to die of thirst and dehydration in a very short time in that hot desert climate. And they were ready to stone Moses. They said, we're all going to die here, but you're going to die first. We're going to court-martial you in the desert and execute you by stoning. Stoning is not mob violence, it's community execution. And they're going to execute Moses, and that'll be it. And Moses goes to God and says, these people are ready to court-martial me. They're ready to execute me as a traitor to the nation, having brought them here to die. And Lord, I didn't bring them here. You brought them here. It says at the beginning of the passage that it was at God's commandment that they came to this particular desert. And so the real complaint is not against Moses. The real complaint is against God, isn't it? And that's seen at the end of the passage where it says, is the Lord among us or not? And the implication is he's not. Now, what did he promise? That he'd be among them. Is he among them? No, they say, because he's left us to die here in the desert. God's guilty. And therefore, they want to bring charges against God. Now, God's not available for trial, so they want to put Moses on trial as God's representative. That's the scene. And Moses says, Lord, what will I do? They're ready to stone me, and it's really you they're after. And God says to Moses, take with you the elders of Israel. Now, it's a law case. These are the judges of Israel. Take them with you. Take in your hand the rod with which, and it's identified, the rod with which you struck the river of Egypt. With that rod, you struck the Nile, and it turned to blood. That's a rod of judgment, isn't it? God brought down his judgments on Egypt in the plagues and delivered his people by bringing down his judgments. Now take your rod of judgment in your hand, take the judges with you, the elders, pass on before the people. It's a public occasion. The people want a trial, they'll have a trial. And then God says, I will stand before you there upon the rock. And Moses is to strike the rock on which God stands and with which he's identified. And God's name is the rock in the songs of Moses, right? In Deuteronomy. God our rock, his work is perfect. Their rock, the gods of the heathen, their rock is not like our rock. Rock was a common name for the gods in the ancient Near East. It's a divine title. So Moses is to strike the rock, which is the very name of God, on which God stands, and with which he's identified. Moses couldn't strike, you see, into the heart of the Shekinah glory, could he? He couldn't do that and live, but he's to strike the very rock on which God stands. God comes, stands in the prisoner's dock. Nowhere in the Old Testament do you have God standing before a man. It's always men that stand before God. And in those days, read Deuteronomy 25, when somebody's found guilty of an offense, he comes and stands before the judge. The judge pronounces judgment, and the judge takes a rod and beats him. He inflicts the judgment right away. It wasn't imprisonment, it was corporal punishment delivered on the spot. And God comes, stands before Moses as a judge. Moses lifting the rod of judgment. Isaiah 30 describes the time when God's rod of judgment comes down on the nations, and with the sound of trumpets and martial music, God's judgments fall on the nations. And Moses' rod, I wonder what the people thought when Moses had his rod up as to what would happen when it came down. But he brought it down on the rock where God was standing. And from the rock there flowed forth the water of life. The rock of ages that is struck for us. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, the rock that followed them was Christ. It's Christ himself who bears the smiting. I was only in Israel once, and I had a seatmate on the plane going in, an Israeli who was a Sabra, a man who had been born in Israel. Hebrew was his native language, and I asked him what God was like. What did he think about God? And he said, well, I guess there's some sort of ultimate force, some final principle of things, and perhaps we don't know much about it, but I guess something like that. And I had my little Hebrew Bible with me, and I opened it to Exodus 17 and had him read that passage, and then we talked about it a little bit. And he appreciated right away that Reeve business, that it was a law case and a judgment, and they're ready to... He could understand. He went with all of that. And then I asked him, God stood in the rock and received the blow, didn't he? And I said, is your God like that? And he broke off the conversation, wouldn't talk to me anymore. He saw where that went. That only goes one place. That only goes to Calvary. Exodus 17, and there's Calvary. God bears the blow. Well, God will come and he will save. He will save because he will save by his own power. He will save in his redemptive grace. He will tread their iniquities underfoot, but he will be identified with his people. Identified as the shepherd. The shepherd figure in the Old Testament. Think about Psalm 23. Marvelous figure. God becoming a shepherd. A shepherd has a very peculiar relation to sheep. He's with them all the time. He's identified with them. He knows them by name. He's among them. Shepherds are very smelly men, if you may know some. Being with the sheep all the time, you begin to smell like one, and the flies that collect around them collect around you, and you're very much, in a way, a kind of servant of the sheep, aren't you? You're with them, and Jesus comes as the good shepherd, identified with the sheep, and bearing their judgment. Well, there's so much there, but God's servant will come to save because he is God's son. Jesus Christ is the true Israel. Isaiah 49:3, God says, "Thou art my servant Israel, in you will I be glorified." You are my servant Israel, in you will I be glorified. But that's addressed to the individual servant. Now, in the servant songs in Isaiah, some of them describe Israel as a people. Some of them describe the individual servant, the one who's to come. And it's a little hard to tell which is which sometimes because they're so closely drawn together. Because they're drawn together so closely because it's the individual servant who will represent the people. But in that Isaiah 49:3, you find that the one who is the individual servant of the Lord, look at the earlier verses of 49, you see it's the individual servant who's in view. And to this individual servant it says, you are my servant Israel, and you will I be glorified. Henri Blochet, who's, in my opinion, a theologian without peer in the evangelical world. He's a Baptist theologian teaches at the seminary in Vaux-sur-Seine near Paris. And he has a beautiful little book on the songs of the servant. If you ever can get Blochet, B-L-O-C-H-E-R, Blochet. He presented this very forcefully, that the individual servant is the one who is called Israel, my servant. In you I will be glorified. You see, Christ comes as the true Israel. He says, I am the true vine. The vine was the symbol of Israel in the Old Testament. Jesus is the true Israel. Jesus is the one who's tested in the wilderness. Jesus is the one who is God's Son. And all the promises to Israel as the Son of God are promises that are true for us in Jesus Christ. He is the chosen, the elect Son. He's the beloved Son, Genesis 22, the offering of Isaac. He is the royal son, Psalm 2, Psalm 110. He's God's anointed, the suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah 52 and 53. And we'll come to that a little bit in the next hour. It's fulfilled by the Lord because he comes as the Lord of the covenant, dwelling among his people. He's the one who comes. He is the one who delivers. He is the one who fulfills all these promises. He comes as the Lord of the covenant to dwell among them. We saw that, John 1:14. He's heralded by the angels in Luke 2. He's named by the Father as my beloved Son. When he comes up out of the water of baptism, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. He is the one who shows by his mighty works that he is the Lord himself present among his people. He fulfills the promises in Isaiah 35 when John the Baptist couldn't understand why it was that Jesus wasn't delivering him from Herod. John the Baptist had said that Jesus would come, that the servant of the Lord would come and chop down every tree of wickedness and destroy all wickedness and bring in God's salvation. Well, Jesus was bringing in miracles of blessing, but where were the miracles of judgment? John the Baptist couldn't understand it. Doesn't the Old Testament promise both? Certainly does. Well, why doesn't Jesus bring in the judgment? And if he's going to chop down trees of wickedness, why doesn't Jesus start with Herod? There's a fine tree of wickedness to chop down, and John the Baptist could get free from Herod's prison where he was. So John sends his messengers to Jesus. You read about it in Luke 7. He sends his messengers to Jesus and with a searching question, are you the one who comes? Or are we looking for another? He had been promising the coming of the Lord in terms of Isaiah 40, that God was going to come, and that the servant was going to come, and the Lord was coming, whose shoelace he wasn't worthy to unloose, divine Lord coming as the Messiah. And now the judgment wasn't coming. Why wasn't it? John couldn't understand. Jesus took John's emissaries with him and performed more of his miracles. And then he reminded him of what he'd been doing. He reminded him that the lame could walk and the blind could see and even the dead could be raised. All these things could be done. And these are the promised deeds. And there Jesus is practically quoting from Isaiah 35. He's saying, I'm doing exactly what was promised would be done. And then he says to... having summarized it for John's emissaries, he says, and tell John, blessed is he whosoever does not take offense on account of me. In other words, he's saying to John, John, you let me do it my way, and I'll do it. And you realize that I'm going to do it my way. And of course, What was Jesus' way? He came not to bring the judgment, but to bear the judgment. Not to lift the spear against the Romans, but to receive the spear in his side. Because he came to be the rock smitten for us. He came to be the Passover lamb slain for us. He came to be the true Isaac, the one that was not slain on Mount Moriah. Jesus came to be the son that was slain. As Paul says, God spared not his only son, but delivered him up for us all. Abraham could spare his son, but the promise given to Abraham was the Lord will provide. Will provide not just the ram in the thicket, but will provide the true son, the true seed of the promise, the true Isaac, the true son that would bring in the redemption. And Jesus Christ is that son. He performs the miracles that were promised. He fulfills everything. You know, the New Testament is so emphatic that Jesus fulfills everything promised. Jesus comes as the Lord. And as the Lord, he speaks and it's done. He commands and it happens. And as the Lord, he can walk on the sea. And that reminds us of verses in the Psalms that talk about the Lord's ways being on the mighty waters, you know. And Psalm 102, where he brings them into his into their desired haven. That's all the work of Jesus. Jesus gets into the boat and it comes in, you know. There are overtones all the way through that Jesus is doing what only God can do. And therefore you have those discourses in John where Jesus tells them plainly, before Abraham was, I am. And they accuse him of blasphemy, and rightly so, if he were not true God. But he is claiming his deity in those discourses in John, that he is the Logos. He is the one who is from the beginning. So he comes as the Lord, but he also comes as the servant. He's the God-man. He's the one who's going to bear our offenses in his own body on the tree. He's the suffering servant. He's God's anointed. Jesus comes as both Lord and servant. So the history of the Bible all leads us to Jesus Christ. Let's take one moment to look at some of the principles. It's in your outline also. The Christological principles in redemptive history. How does the whole history of the Bible lead us to Christ? Well, first, covenant history leads to Christ as its goal. That's what we've been seeing all along. Covenant history anticipates Christ in its symbolism. There are symbolic events in the Old Testament, aren't there? The Exodus symbolizes more than the immediate political deliverance, right? It shows that God's the saving God. And God so describes himself. And you find that God being praised in the Psalms as the God of salvation, the God who delivered his people from Egypt. He's the God who's shown his power in history. And some symbolic events are directly identified as such. Think of the Passover. There's an event in history, in Israel's history, that results in their deliverance from Egypt. But it's an event that has woven in with it the symbolism of the killing of the Passover lamb and the putting the blood on the doorposts. So you see what I'm getting at? What God does in the Old Testament, in salvation, becomes a symbol of what he will finally do, right? So there's a symbolic aspect to events. There's prophetic symbolism, of course. The prophets are told to perform symbolic actions at different times. There's ceremonial symbolism in the tabernacle and the sacrificial system. And there's what I would call official symbolism. And by that I mean the symbolism of office, the symbolism of role that people are to play. David, as the king, is symbolic of God's rule among the people. David, when he writes the Psalms, is not writing as a private individual. It's not like private modern poetry. It's the Psalms of the King. And people identify with the experience of David because he is their king. He is their representative. And when David is distraught and cries out to God for deliverance, he's thinking of the people as well, and the people are identified with him. So David, what happens to David, has symbolic force because he is God's anointed. When David goes against Goliath, what's the situation? Is it just that the little, Sunday school stories get David younger and younger with his slingshot, because you want to have him identify with the junior age. And so here he is in the junior department as a little junior with a slingshot. Quite a bad example, you come to think about it, kids with slingshots. But anyway, here is David. But how does he really come in the Bible story? Well, he's already a warrior. He's already taken care of a lion and a bear. He's no little junior age. But he can wear Saul's armor. He doesn't set it aside because he can't fill it. He sets it aside because he's not used to it. But he takes the weapon he's used to. But how does he come against Goliath? He says to Goliath, "You come to me," and he gives a quick inventory of Goliath's weapons. He says, "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel." Now, how does he come? Just as a warrior? Does he say, "Oh, Goliath, you think you're pretty big and good, but I've got a little higher technology than you have. I got a ballistic missile." Is that the way he comes? I've got it cased here. No, he comes. He comes in his role. He's already been anointed by Samuel. He comes as the Lord's anointed. He says, "I come to you." That's why he couldn't stand all that challenging going on by Goliath and nobody answering, because he represents the Lord. He's God's anointed. He says, "I come to you, therefore, in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel." It's a role that he fulfills. But the role, you see, has typological significance, because the Lord's anointed is a prefiguring of the Lord's anointed, the Messiah, which means the anointed, So he's coming as a Messiah, preparing us for the Messiah, who by God's great mercy would be descended from his line. So there is role symbolism in the Old Testament, official symbolism, not just the king, David, but also the prophet like unto Moses in Deuteronomy 18, and also as a priest. A priest not after the order of Aaron, but after the order of Melchizedek, as we're taught in the Epistle to the Hebrews. So you have official symbolism. You understand what I mean by official? The symbolism of office, the symbolism of role, what he fulfills. Now, of course, skip over that for a minute. Covenant history reveals Christ and his salvation. It does so directly in epiphanies, that is to say, in appearances of the Lord in the Old Testament. Joshua meets this warrior, and when he's crossed the Jordan and ready to begin the military attack on Jericho, and this armed warrior comes toward him in the darkness, and Joshua says, "Are you with us or are you with them?" And what does the warrior say? "Neither, you got it wrong. I'm the captain of the Lord's host. I'm in charge here. I'm your general. You've got it wrong." it's not a question of whether I fight for you. It's a question of whether you fight for me. So you see, there's an appearance of Christ. Really, it's an epiphany, an appearance of the Lord. It's as an epiphany, an appearance of the Lord, that the angel wrestles with Jacob. A wonderful, intimate description of Christ in that passage, if you want to look at it. But the Spirit of Christ in the Old Testament, actualizing redemption. Christ, God bears with Israel as their shepherd and as the Spirit of the Lord among them in Isaiah 63. And I read that passage earlier in 1 Peter 1:11. But now let's think a minute about this point of the historical symbols of God, of Christ in the Old Testament. And this is that diagram that's included with your materials, which may look a little puzzling. I want to spend a minute with it. You see, here you have the line of the history of Revelation. History of Revelation follows the history of redemption. History of redemption, what God does. History of Revelation, God's telling us about what He's doing. The Bible traces both together. The Revelation accompanies the redemption. So, a truth revealed at one point in the history of Revelation follows through to the ultimate realization of the truth in Jesus Christ. A truth revealed at a certain part of the Old Testament, truth to the first power, is carried in Jesus Christ to truth to the nth power, truth in its full realization in Jesus Christ, okay? No truth gets lost in the shuffle. God doesn't give a truth and then forget about it. There's always a continuity in the fulfillment of the truth that God reveals. You take an event in the Old Testament, just take one that there wouldn't be an argument about, take the Passover. Now, the Passover event is full of symbolism, obviously. And the symbolism points us to a particular truth. And what's the truth? The truth is we all deserve death. God required death not only of the firstborn of Egypt, but of the firstborn of Israel, because all of us are doomed to death as sinners, not just Egyptians, all of us. And so we're due to die. But by obeying the word of the Lord, they kill a lamb, which obviously functions as a substitute. They eat the lamb. There's identification with the lamb. But the blood of the lamb is put on the doorposts, and the angel of death, seeing the blood on the doorpost, passes over them. So it includes the truth of substitutionary sacrifice. It includes the truth of salvation through propitiation, that is, through the fulfillment of the judgment on the part of the lamb that would propitiate the wrath of God against sin. So you have these truths that are revealed, and those truths all come to their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us, Paul writes. So there's the fulfillment in Jesus Christ of the Passover symbolism. Now, if there's symbolism in the first place, and the history of redemption goes through, and always does go through, then if you can draw this line of symbolism and this line of the continuity of the history of redemption, then you can draw this line, which is the line of typology. It's just drawing a hypotenuse after you've got the two legs of the triangle. Now, this is typology. If you don't have any symbolism in the first place, you don't have typology in the second place, okay? But if you do have symbolism in the first place, you always have typology in the second place. Now, I was instructed when I was a student at Westminster Seminary myself many years ago, I was instructed that you can only find types when the New Testament identifies them as types. Well, that's playing it safe. That's like saying in my book you always say maths over here. We always say math in the singular in the United States. Why do you say maths? Well, don't answer that question. But you have a maths book. Is that right? Would you say that? Okay. You have a maths book, and you say, I couldn't solve any problems in the front of this book that aren't solved in the back. Well, that's a confession of mathematical inadequacy, wouldn't you say? And I think this to say that you can't find any type in the Old Testament that isn't specifically identified in the New Testament is a confession of hermeneutical bankruptcy. That is, confession of a bankruptcy of a biblical interpretation. You're saying the New Testament authors can do it. They can come up with types, but I can't for the life of me figure out how they do it. So I wouldn't dare to find a type because I wouldn't have a clue on how to do it. And I'm saying this. We find from the New Testament not only that there are types, but we find out how the types are put together. They're put together along the principles that I've given here. I'm convinced that where you find symbolism in the Old Testament, you think of what that symbolism teaches, see where that teaching goes, and if you got this and this, you can always have this. But where things aren't specifically identified, you can nevertheless get them from the Old Testament in its relation to the New. Was the event of the offering of Isaac symbolical? Did it have symbolism in it? Of course it did. The whole thing of a sacrifice and all that. But also it's identified. What's the place called? Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will see to it. And in that whole chapter, there are many plays on the words see. And it says, in the mount of the Lord it will be seen. And in the Hebrew word, to provide is a form of the verb to see. We do that in English too. God will see to it, right? He will see it, he will see to it. And that's what God does. He will see to it. And what is the fulfillment? Well, of course, that God will provide. Provide what? Provide not just the ram caught in the thicket, but provide the real substitute for Isaac. Isaac can't do it. He's a sinner. Abraham couldn't be redeemed from his own sin by sacrificing a son who was also a sinner. So there has to be the pure and perfect sacrifice symbolized by the ram, but that will come only in Jesus Christ. So where you have symbolism, you always have typology. And so the offering of Isaac becomes a type of the offering of Christ. And that becomes very important for us because it helps us to understand the reality of God's love. You see Abraham's heart torn as he goes up the mountain. And Isaac says to him, here's the fire, here's the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Think of Abraham's heart when he says that. And then he says, son, God will provide. God will provide. And when we read, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, don't you see the depth of that comes from the incident of the offering of Isaac? God spared not his own Son. And Jesus, too, asked the Father, in effect, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? He says, Lord, he asked God if there's any other way, you can do all things. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But no, it's not possible. This is the way. And God gives his own Son. And Jesus is the true Isaac, isn't he? He's the true laughter, too. Isaac means laughter. And Abraham laughed when God promised he'd have a son. Sarah laughed, too. And the angel said, you laughed. And she's very embarrassed. She said, no, I didn't laugh, not me. Oh, you laughed. God wants it on the record so that when the little child is born, she calls him laughter, as God commanded. Isaac means laughter. And then she says, everyone that hears it will laugh with me. She laughed out of the other side of her mouth now and laughed in joy, laughed because it was so ridiculous. At my age, having a child, who would have ever believed it? This is really funny. But God's telling us, you see, symbolism all the way, right? And typology, therefore, as it points to Jesus Christ. And what you do when you share with others as a Bible teacher, Bible preacher, or just as parents and children or grandchildren or whatever, as you tell others about the story of Jesus, you're bringing out the significance. You see, the meaning is given to us in Christ. There's the meaning. And then we apply that meaning to people's needs by preaching, teaching, communicating. We are making known the significance of that meaning that's found in Christ. Now, here are two lines that aren't so good. They're in dark. But one is allegory, and one is moralism. Now, moralism means you go back and tell a story. You tell about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and all you emphasize is Abraham's obedience. See, Abraham was being tested. Is that right? Was he being tested? Sure, it says so in the first verse of Genesis 22. So he's being tested, all right. But you could teach that just as an example of obedience. Abraham followed the Lord. He was obedient. If you're going to follow the Lord, you must be obedient. Is that right? Of course it's right. But is that the whole story? No, it's not. What's the whole story? Not just Abraham's obedience, but it was an obedience of faith. That's the story. And faith in what? Faith in Jehovah Jireh. Faith in the God who provides. See? So when you tell Old Testament stories, what you're after is never just the courage of David going against Goliath, or the agony of Abraham as he obeys this impossible command to offer up the son who's the son of the promise. That's not the whole picture. The whole picture is not just obedience, because of course there's plenty of disobedience too, and that can serve as a kind of counter indication. You can be obedient like David, not disobedient like Saul. That's all fine. But see, that's all moralism. And that's what gives the idea that Sunday school is a goody-goody affair. You be good. You be good. And you tell kids from the time they're ever so little, you be good. And that's all you tell them. You always got to be good. And then what do they think later? They think that Christianity is nothing but a whole bunch of rules, that you should be good. And I'm tired of being good. I want to be bad. It sounds like more fun. And, you haven't got across the real seriousness of the gospel and the need of redemption. Oh, I know you can't do it with little children the same way you can with older children, but remember, the heroes of Hebrews 11, what are they heroes of? Faith. See? Not that they were so bold, but that they were believers. And when you say somebody's a believer, what are you focusing on? Not what they do. Look at this. How could a man in one lifetime ever work up so much faith? You give them a double rating as faithing. They really learn to faith it. And come on, what does faith point to? Faith means, I can't do it, Lord, only you can, right? Faith is an empty hand stretched out to God. You're not dangling your faith before God because it's so great. If you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, it doesn't have to be big, it has to be there, that's all. Faith, trusting in the Lord. I know there's other ways you can talk about little faith and great faith. Yes, that's true enough, but still. The point of faith is the trust is in God. And therefore, the emphasis is on the Lord, what He's done. So you don't just give morality when you teach Bible stories, you give theology. That is, you explain grace, you explain faith. It's gospel teaching. It's gospel teaching all the way. Because gospel teaching says salvation is of the Lord. Because of my own background, upbringing, and so on, I had reached the point when I was in college that I doubted if I had any right to call myself a Christian. I struggled with sins and temptations, and I couldn't seem to get anywhere with them. And I finally thought, this is ridiculous. I'm not a Christian, or I wouldn't be struggling with temptation like this all the time. It got to me, and I spent a whole, I spent a week or more just reading the Bible starting in Genesis 1, just reading it right on every day, because I didn't even know where to look in the Bible, so I was just reading. And I came to Jonah 2, and I read that verse, salvation is the Lord. And it suddenly dawned on me that it was God that was saving me. It wasn't my grip on him, it was his grip on me. And I suddenly realized that when my grip was slipping, that my only recourse was say, Lord, take hold. Lord, deliver me. Lord, you're the Savior, not me. And that was truth I sorely needed. And it's the truth we all need, say, faith in God. That's the way. Not moralism. Now, yes, you got to have 10 commandments, of course. Yes, you got to be told how to live to please God. Yes, but God gives his commandments to people that he's delivered. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. I've delivered you. You're mine. You're my people. Now, live that way. Christ died in your place. So when he died, you died. So how do you live? You live by crucifying the flesh. That is, you live by yielding up your members to Christ. Christ rose for you, didn't he? When he rose, you rose. So what do? Seek the things that are above. Because where Jesus is, there you are. You're united to him. Our whole Christian life is a life of faith, isn't it? No, we keep rules and regulations, but we do so out of love because of what God has done for us. That's the response. Well, this line, too, is pretty bad. I declare it can't be an hour already. See, your pastor predicted all this. Well, we'll finish with this then. The allegory, what's that? Well, that's just going back, and you realize that Christ ought to be in the whole Bible. Yeah, should be. He really should be. And you look and you don't see him. So you want to get him there somehow, right? So you grab something and make it a type. And that's what has given typology a bad name. Just an allegorical going back to grab anything. Now, don't get upset about Galatians 3. Paul does use the word allegory, but he's using it in the sense of what we are calling typology. He's not talking about any connection of anything that makes no sense at all. He's talking about something built into the history of redemption. Allegory is just association. And since our minds work by association, every one of us can associate anything with anything. I could challenge you in that, give you 5 minutes. I give you 2 things, I'll guarantee you can associate. Now that's, it's done in business. You can't see how to solve a problem, so what do? You try to try another approach. You brainstorm, and somebody says something utterly ridiculous, and everybody laughs. And then somebody says, now, wait a minute. Why not do that? Look, we could do that this way. And, when your mind hits a dead end, well, you try another rail and see if you can bypass it. Well, you can always connect things, so it's easy to do that. Yes, sir?
Give an example.
Yeah.
And the dangers.
Yeah, sure. Here, let me take a real little Bible text, one that looks so small you think I couldn't preach on it at all. Here's a Bible text for you, and I'll just show it to you. And a chair. And a chair, Bible text. When the widow furnished an upper room for Elisha, she furnished it with a table and a bed and a chair. So there it is, and a chair. I will now preach a sermon on and a chair. And you could do it too, it's obviously, what do? Well, you picture a scene, let's say a dining room scene. And here is the rocking chair of the grandmother who's sitting there waiting. having exhausted herself helping with the preparation, she's sitting rocking in the chair. And you talk about old age and old age in relation to the Lord. And then you say there's the little high chair of the little grandson. And you talk about the gift of children and all that. And then there's the empty chair, the chair of the prodigal, the son who's wandered off and got into drugs. And so you talk about that. And well, I don't need to go on, do I? I mean, you could all do that. Mention anything, it always suggests something. And so you can find Christ anywhere the way a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, with no structure at all, no understanding of what the Bible's really saying at all. And dear friends, I am not advocating that. I am not advocating flights of the imagination. I'm asking, what does the text really say in its context? What is presented there? And how does what it says, carry us forward to what God's ultimately going to do along that very line, you see? How does it anticipate? How does it prepare? That they without us would not be made perfect. That what was happening to them is preparing for what finally happens through Jesus Christ to us in the full redemption that we have in Him. Well, that's time for... Isn't this when we quit, lunchtime? I was afraid it was.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Clowney. And we're actually preaching through Elijah and Elisha this summer, so I'll bear that in mind if we get really short. There's something to say about the guest room. Excellent. Thank you very, very much. There is some soup which has been prepared. It's over here. We're free for an hour now, I think, aren't we? So obviously you might like to go and get a bit of air as well, so just get a little bit warm in here. But we do want to thank Dr. Clowney very, very much. If only we could have him back every day for a month, that would be a very good thing, wouldn't it? But anyway, let's express our appreciation again.